Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the 2025 Winter Ag Workshop Series. Today, we're joined with Beth from Penn State Extension for a workshop on food safety. So first, a couple little things to go over. If you have not taken the pretest, it is in the chat box. So go ahead and do that. That is one of the requirements for earning Act 48 hours if you're interested in that. We will also have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the session. So if you think of any questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them at some point. Now, all of you are muted and you're not visible, screen sharing, anything like that. So the chat box is the way to communicate if you have any like technical questions, anything like that, go ahead and drop those in there and we'll help you out. All right. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Beth.
Hey everyone, let me share my screen. So just give me a minute. Cassidy will let me know.
Yep, you're good.
Awesome. Well, I am so happy to be here today. So I appreciate the invitation to speak with you on food safety. It's my favorite topic. So I hope we have a rich conversation in which I could be in person with everyone to see your faces, but this will have to do. My name is Beth. I am an educator with Penn State Extension on the Food, Families, and Community team. So if you're not familiar with Penn State Extension, we believe at Penn State Extension that all people should have access to science-based information. We are a land-grant institution. And what that means is that we are a part of the College of Agricultural Sciences, and we focus our programs in our areas of excellence. I am on the Food, Families, and Community team, so I conduct programming in health and wellness, food safety and quality, and family well-being. So you may be familiar with Penn State Extension through 4-H programming or Master Watershed Stewards or our Master Gardener program. Each of our 67 counties in Pennsylvania have an extension office in their communities, so we can engage with the public. So what we are here to talk about today is food safety. We want to talk about why food safety is important. We'll show some practical ways to keep food safe. And then I encourage you to share this information with others, whether that's family members, colleagues, coworkers, and especially your students, because it takes all of us to keep our food safe. So first, we want to talk about kind of two definitions, foodborne illness and foodborne outbreak. So foodborne illness occurs probably more commonly than you think. If I was in person, I would ask a show of hands to ask, who has been impacted by a foodborne illness. And I would say that, plenty of us have for sure. So foodborne illness is caused by eating food that contains either a biological, a chemical, or a physical hazard. And then an outbreak occurs when 2 or more people experience that same illness after eating the same food. So the Center for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that each year, 48 million people acquire a foodborne illness. And we know most cases involve minor digestive symptoms, vomiting, diarrhea, but severe cases result in approximately 128,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths each year. So, and these exact numbers are really impossible to determine. I would say that these are lower numbers than reality. Because a lot of mild cases are mistaken for an upset stomach or that 24-hour flu, and they're not treated by a physician. So I would say, foodborne illness numbers are probably a lot higher than this. So there are so we ask, like, how does our food become contaminated? How do these foodborne outbreaks happen? So the CDC has identified 5 common causes of foodborne illness. So the first one is failing to cook food adequately. So this means we're failing to cook food to that proper temperature that it needs to get to. So cooking is really the only way we have of actually destroying harmful bacteria. So the second cause is holding food at an incorrect temperature. So we're going to talk a lot about something called the temperature danger zone, which is 40 degrees to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So we need to keep our food out of that temperature danger zone as much as possible. Third cause is using contaminated equipment that wasn't maybe properly cleaned or sanitized. Fourth one is very important. That's poor personal hygiene on the part of who is handling food. And then our fifth one is purchasing food from unsafe sources. So we're going to talk about each of these. So first we want to talk about, who are susceptible populations to a foodborne illness. So susceptible populations are those who are at that higher risk for illness and even death from contaminated food. So our susceptible populations include the very young, so preschool age kids. And the reason for that is that their immune systems just aren't fully developed yet. We have our adults over the age of 65. So kind of the alternate reason for the very young adults over the age of 65, their immune systems just maybe aren't working as well as, they used to when they were younger. So we also have pregnant women who are susceptible to certain bacteria. And then we have those with chronic illness or weakened immune systems. So, for example, someone receiving cancer therapy, or folks who are immunocompromised with a chronic illness, for example. So I will say, though, these are our susceptible population, but this does not mean that a healthy, 20-something cannot get a severe case of a foodborne illness. So personal story, my sister, about a decade ago, very healthy 30-something, right? Did not have underlying health problems. She got salmonella from a salad bar in Chicago and was in the hospital for 5 days with salmonella. She was so ill, she was so much in pain that they gave her morphine for it. So it does happen to healthy individuals, as well as our susceptible populations. So we're going to talk about these causes of foodborne illness, and we've got 3 causes. So first word we're going to talk about is a hazard, right? So a hazard is any harmful substance that when it is in food, it can cause foodborne illness. And we've got 3 of them. So we've got chemical hazards, we've got physical hazards, and then we've got biological hazards. So our first one are chemical hazards. So these are the toxic substances that can cause foodborne illness if they can get into food. So detergents, sanitizers, pesticides, some fish toxins that are naturally occurring, mushroom toxins that are naturally occurring. And then our allergens fit into this category as well. So allergens, as we know, an allergic reaction is an overreaction of the immune system to an allergen. So this substance could be harmless or not usually cause an immune response in most people. But when it comes into contact with the body, the immune system may produce antibodies that attack it. So this can cause a range of symptoms from mild to life-threatening. So these are our big 9 food allergens. So I will say, this list does change in 2021, or I should say before 2021, it was the big 8. In 2021, sesame was actually added to this list. So as you can see, we've got our peanuts, our tree nuts, eggs, milk, sesame, which was added in 2021. Wheat, our soy, fish, and our crustacean shellfish. So there are a lot of foods that cause allergic reactions. There are over 160 different foods, but the big 9, these big 9 foods account for about 90% of all allergic reactions. So we do take a lot of care to make sure that these big 9 are identified, they're clearly labeled in foods that have these allergens, especially if the inclusion of this food is not obvious, right? So that's where you see that label that says contains milk, contains wheat. We want to make sure that everyone knows that there is an allergen. Now, I will say, and these are two very recent news articles, that there are a lot of recalls that are due to undeclared allergens. And in fact, the second one that you see, the Lay's potato chips, this happened just last week, that there was an undeclared allergen in Lay's potato chips. So they set the risk level to folks as the highest possible. So it's a life-threatening risk level because it contains, there was an undeclared allergen of milk in the Lay's potato chips. So this does happen, recalls of food due to undeclared allergens, and it happens quite a bit. So I just wanted to kind of highlight two of the most recent ones. There's a chocolate recall update and then the Lay's potato chip recall. The Lay's potato chip recall, I believe, is in some Western states, so it was not a nationwide recall. So then we've got our physical hazards. So, thinking of what physically can get into our food and make us sick. So these are kind of shavings from a can. These are false fingernails, insects, a broken piece of glass. So if someone is getting ice from an ice container and they use the glass to get that ice, that glass can break and then that glass can become a physical hazard, right? Also a natural part of the food. So, if you're cooking or if you're baking a cherry pie, you want to make sure that you're being very safe and being careful to kind of inspect what you're baking beforehand because there could be cherry pits inside it. So this physical hazard's not going to cause an illness like we see with biological hazards, right? But it can cause injury for sure. If a piece of glass was in a salad, it can cut a person's mouth, or a fish bone could cause someone to choke. So then finally, we've got our biological hazards, and these are kind of those pathogenic microorganisms that contaminate food. And this is, I think, what we think of most when we think of foodborne outbreaks and foodborne illnesses. So if we break down the word pretty simply, micro means small, and organisms are living things. So our biological hazards are microorganisms so small that they can only be seen through a microscope. So this graphic just kind of shows you how small bacteria are. So if you're kind of looking at our big red dot, that's our grain of salt, which we know is very small. Then our yeast, our mold spores, our bacteria is so small that we would never be able to see it on our food. So, this just kind of reminds us that there is no sight test, no smell test, right, to determine whether our food is safe to eat or not. So when we're talking microorganisms, there are two different types of microorganisms. We have our pathogens, and then we have spoilage microorganisms. So spoilage microorganisms, you would know, right? You pull it out of the fridge. Let's say we've got our apple cider from the fall season, right? And we put it way at the back of our fridge and we forget about it until February, right? And you say, hey, there's that apple cider. And you open it up and it smells like alcohol, right? So those spoilage microorganisms make food taste or look or smell unappetizing. But we don't really worry as much about spoilage microorganisms. Number one, because they give us, warning that they're there, right? They smell bad, they taste bad, they look bad, but they also rarely make a person ill. It's our pathogens, right? It's those pathogenic microorganisms that make us sick. And these are the ones that are not going to give us warning. We can't see them, we can't smell them, we can't taste them, but we can become very ill from them. So no such thing as a sniff test. So there are 4 different types of pathogenic microorganisms, and they include bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. So when we're thinking of our hazards, we've got our biological hazards, we've got our chemical and our physical. Our biological hazards are these 4, and they comprise 95% of all of our foodborne illnesses, right? So this is why kind of preventing the contamination of these is very, very important. So just going to briefly go through all four of them. Bacteria is our number one. They're found on raw food. They're added either through mishandling of food or they're on raw food to begin with. So naturally as part of the food. So if food is mishandled, the bacteria that's present is going to grow and multiply in the food. So that is why it's so important to use that thermometer to cook the food to its proper internal temperature, because that is what destroys bacteria. Freezing does not destroy bacteria. So there's a lot of different types of bacteria that can cause a foodborne illness. The more common ones that we hear about when we're hearing about these kind of foodborne outbreaks are Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria. So you may have heard of outbreaks of Salmonella from cucumbers in November. That was a multi-state outbreak that affected Pennsylvania. The E. coli outbreak affecting Quarter Pounders at McDonald's with the slivered onions. And then Listeria, we heard about Listeria with the Boar's Head nationwide outbreak that sickened 61 people across 19 states and resulted in 10 deaths. So those are kind of the big three that we've heard about in the latter half of the year 2024. So bacteria reproduce by doubling. So one cell, good math equation for us, right? For our students, one cell becomes two cells, two becomes four, so on and so forth pretty quickly. And in some cases, in that temperature danger zone, which we're going to talk a lot about, the number of bacteria can double every 20 minutes. So, you can imagine that that quickly reaches a level that can make a person sick. That's why it's so important to make sure that we're controlling things that we can control in the kitchen to curb this exponential growth. So our viruses are our second pathogen. Viruses such as norovirus, which we're hearing a lot about right now because there's been a lot of outbreaks in norovirus. Viruses are the leading cause of most foodborne illness outbreaks. Norovirus is surging right now. And sometimes we hear the stomach flu, right? That's our norovirus, or the winter vomiting bug, right? So this is norovirus. They need a living host to grow, so they need us to grow. Unlike bacteria, they don't grow and multiply in food, but they can survive in food. So what we need to do to control viruses is to make sure that we are using good sanitation practices. What happens is viruses that cause foodborne illness are shed in feces when we go to the bathroom. So they can be introduced through contaminated food or water, or if we're not washing our hands after using the bathroom, that is how these viruses get into our food. So our third one is parasites. So these are our single-celled organisms. They can contaminate food. They need a living host to grow, just like our viruses, but they cannot reproduce. So a lot of our parasites are present in water, in food, and they range in size. So some of them are so tiny that we can't see with the naked eye, but then other ones are worms, right, that we can actually see and are visible with our eyes. Some that we might have heard are Giardia, or Trichinella, which sometimes there are outbreaks of Trichinella in pork products. So proper cooking destroys these parasites. Again, this is why it's so important to make sure we're cooking food to its proper internal temperature. And then our fourth one are our fungi, right? So these are microorganisms that could be beneficial, but also can be harmful. When we're thinking about molds and yeast, they could be a natural part of food, right? So certain kind of cheeses or breads or our malted beverages. But we can also have unwanted mold and yeast, and these cause food to spoil. And then in the case of mold, can cause illness. So what happens with mold is that they can produce toxins or poisons that may cause illness in certain maybe people or susceptible people. While mold spores can be killed by heat, their toxins, the poisons that they produce, are not destroyed. So yeast can grow in items such as jams or jellies, fruits, and you'll see it. You'll see it, you'll smell it. It might have an alcohol smell. You'll see it, it might have like a pink discoloration or some sliminess. But the take-home message with mold is that, like, you can't look at a loaf of bread and say, like, oh man, I have mold on like one piece of bread. I'm just going to throw that one away. Or cheese, right? Cheese that has a little bit of mold on the side. I'm just going to lop that off and then eat the rest. Unfortunately, that's not best practice. And the reason for that is those mold spores. So remember, those spores can kind of dig down deep into food, and they can produce those toxins that could make us sick. So it really is kind of like a when in doubt, throw it out kind of lesson to learn. You don't want to take a chance if there is spoiled or moldy food. You don't want to just lop off that piece. You really do want to kind of throw out the whole product. So when we're talking about these microorganisms, the number of organisms that cause illness is known as kind of the infective dose. So if you're looking at this graphic, guy's really healthy with no organisms, no microorganisms, many microorganisms is starting to make them sweat a little bit, right? But if you've got that infective dose, that is the number of those organisms that are really going to cause an illness, right? Vomiting, diarrhea, sensations of hot and cold, that sort of thing. And an effective dose really does depend on how healthy a person is, and the type of microorganism that is in the food. So it might take 1 million to 10 million microorganisms to cause illness in a healthy adult, right? So my sister, whenever she had salmonella, it may have taken 10 million microorganisms to make her sick. But a susceptible person, maybe a very young or a person with a compromised immune system, it might only take 10 microorganisms to make them sick. So, it's really important to make sure that we are keeping our food healthy for all people. Because it really does depend on the health of the person. And there are some microorganisms, some pathogens that can cause illness in a healthy adult with an infective dose as low as like 10 cells or 10 microorganisms. Or in terms of parasites, it might take 1 parasite to cause illness. So also you hear about, how long it takes someone to get sick, right? I think some of us think, I ate something, I'm sick. It automatically is the last thing that you ate that made you sick, right? But the time it takes for a person to see symptoms, it's not always the last thing that you ate. So it's known as the incubation period, which can range from that half hour, right? So if you have norovirus, for example, it is very contagious and it happens very quickly. So that might have been the last thing that you ate because you are sick within half hour, an hour. But it can take up to several weeks for some pathogens to make you sick. So for example, hepatitis A, that can take up to 50 days to develop, right? Symptoms of hepatitis A. So 50 days, that takes a long time for you to get sick. So it's hard to kind of trace back what you ate that actually made you sick. And then there's norovirus symptoms, of course, that can happen very quickly. So let's talk, I'm going to pause right here to see if we have any questions. And I'd be happy to answer them.
So if you have a
If not-
question,
Go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, if anyone has a question, go ahead and
Yeah.
drop it in the Q&A.
Yeah.
So far, there's none that are showing.
Okay. No problem. I will rock on, but I'm happy to stop and answer any questions that you all have. So let's talk about how these microorganisms get into our food, they contaminate it, and how they grow in it. So they get into our food supply in a bunch of different ways. So they could be naturally a part of the animal, right? Could also be found in the dirt that produce grows in, right? Or they can be unintentionally added as food is handled and prepared, right? So sometimes these microorganisms are found in our raw foods, right? Eggs and cucumbers, but we can also add these microorganisms while we're handling it and preparing it. So you'll notice that prior to entering the kitchen, microorganisms get into food during the slaughtering process, cross-contaminating in the fields is a natural part of the animal. We can do really nothing about the contamination of food prior to entering the kitchen, right? Prior to us handling the food. But once it's in our kitchen, this is the opportunity where it's our responsibility to keep food safe, right? So, and cross-contamination happens from one food to another if we're using dirty equipment, dirty hands, dirty clothes, and then our poor personal hygiene. So the categories of foods that we're most concerned with are two. So the first one is our ready to eat foods. And we're going to talk about kind of examples of each of these. And then our second one are our what we call TCS foods. So these are foods that need to be controlled. They require time control for safety and temperature control for safety. So the first one are our ready to eat foods. And, you know, kind of just as the name implies, these are foods that are eaten without cooking, without washing, without any further prep on our part, right? So these are items like salads, lunch meats, sandwiches, pastries, candies, right? These foods require a lot of careful handling to prevent contaminating. And then we've got our TCS category. So these are our time and temperature control for safety. These have the right characteristics that basically bacteria love if we're not handling it properly. So our TCS foods include our meats, our melons, poultry, our eggs, seafood, dairy foods, leafy greens, sprouts. Think about the foods that you hear of when you think about kind of a nationwide outbreak, right? The slivered onions from McDonald's, the cucumbers. So these are foods that are ripe and that bacteria really like to kind of reproduce, right? So just kind of a note, it's interesting when we're talking about TCS foods that it's our cut melons and it's our kind of sliced tomatoes. So when we're thinking of our melons, right, we've got a watermelon, we've got a cantaloupe, we can keep those on our counter. We can keep a cantaloupe on our counter, no problem, right? We don't have to control for temperature, right? We don't have to keep an uncut cantaloupe in our fridge. It's when we cut into it that it becomes that we need to kind of put more caution into it, handling it, right? And that is because there might be bacteria on the outside of that melon, right? And what happens is when you cut into it, all of that bacteria, those bacteria become hitchhikers on the knife, right? And now are contaminating kind of the flesh, the inside of our product, right? The same with our tomatoes, right? Tomatoes, you know, we can keep on in our pantry, right? We can keep on our counter. We slice into them, the bacteria can get kind of into the inside, and then we have to protect them more with refrigeration and time control. So I don't know if you all have the capacity to use the chat with each other or if it's just for hosts. So just a quick activity. Which foods are TCS foods? We've got, you can see our list. So some of these, remember, we have to control for time and temperature.
And everyone's chat is available for everyone, so you can go ahead and
Great.
drop your answers in.
Yeah. So what do you think are our TCS foods? The foods that we need to control for time and temperature. Shrimp, I see shrimp, awesome. Raw chicken, squash, sliced tomatoes, pizza, right? It's got dairy products on it. Our sliced tomatoes, love it. Yeah, tofu. Those are our soy products. Good job, everyone. So let's go quickly. Let's just I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Let's go to our whole uncooked squash. So that was like a little trick question. So that is kind of like our uncut melons, right? Whole uncooked squash. I've got some right now in my cold room from the late summer, early fall when I harvested them. They are fine. I don't have to control for temperature until I cut them, right? And then those bacteria become hitchhikers on the knife, and then I've got to protect it. So a whole uncooked squash is not a TCS food. It is when we slice it, it's when we cut into it that it becomes a TCS food. Awesome, good work. So this is a common food service acronym, and it helps us remember how bacteria grow in the food that we need to protect. And I will send out any apologies to any Toms on the call, because we are talking about Fat Tom here for our food service acronym. So our conditions that bacteria really like, we'll talk about these, are food, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. So the first one is food. So think about the foods that we prepare at home, that kids are eating at school. I certainly like protein. I certainly like carbohydrates. Those are the same foods that bacteria like, right? They love bacteria. They like carbohydrates. These are the foods we enjoy. Those are the foods that bacteria enjoy as well. So they need food to grow, and it's those kind of proteins and carbohydrates that they're growing in. Second one is acidity. So of course we've got our pH scale, right? Bacteria need a slightly acidic to a neutral pH to grow. So on this list, you know, they kind of like anywhere from like 5.1 up to that 7.0, right? It's a low acid to a neutral. So as you can see, a lot of common foods have a pH that is ideal for bacterial growth, right? Our carrots, so you can see a lot of vegetables on here. You can see our meat products, our dairy, our eggs, our breads. Tomatoes is interesting. It's kind of like half blue, half red. It's because different varieties of tomatoes have different acidity levels. So, you know, some tomatoes might be, you know, an acidity level that bacteria like, but others may not be. Next one is temperature. So again, our temperature danger zone is between 40 and 140 degrees. So this is the temperature range that bacteria grow the fastest in. And then there's even kind of like a super danger zone, which is the 70 degrees to 125 degrees. And this is where bacteria grow the fastest. So we want to make sure as much as possible that we're keeping our hot foods hot, which is above 140, and we're keeping our cold foods cold, which is below 40 degrees. Then we talked about this a little bit before. The number of bacteria can double every 20 minutes. So each minute, each 20 minutes, our food is in that temperature danger zone. Our bacteria are replicating, they're doubling. Oxygen, so particular type of bacteria like oxygen. So Salmonella, for example, Salmonella bacteria must have oxygen to grow. On the other hand, anaerobic bacteria only grow when oxygen is present. So for example, if we have any home canners on the call, we have to be worried about botulism when we're home canning. Because botulism grows in an oxygen-free environment. So that's why we have to take care to make sure that we're processing our canning at a certain temperature and a certain time for our processing. We've got moisture. So this is our last M. Bacteria like a high level of water. So think about the difference between bread, which is moist, that spoils, right? Because it has a high water content, while crackers, which are dry, can be kept for a long time in our pantry. Bacteria don't like crackers because they're dry, right? They don't have that moisture content that bacteria need to grow. So that's just a little bit about Fat Tom. So now we want to talk about what we can do, right? What can we do to keep our food safe? And there are three conditions that lead to foodborne illness. We've got poor personal hygiene, cross-contamination, and abusing kind of that time and temperature. So the first one is personal hygiene. We all know that it's really important to wash our hands after using the restroom, right? Because the viruses that we have on our hands do not die in food, right? So we always want to make sure that we're washing our hands, of course, before preparing food, after going to the bathroom, after coughing, blowing our nose, before beginning each new task. So when you are prepping food and you're kind of beginning a new prep, right? You're now prepping a different kind of vegetable, for example, you do want to wash your hands in between those two tasks. We all know that our electronic devices are filthy, so you always want to make sure that we're washing our hands after using, our cell phone before we're starting to prep meals. This is just a good graphic. It's a 5-step process. You want to wet your hands, soap your hands, scrub, rinse, and dry. Love that this graphic actually has a 6-step, which is, you just did a great job of washing your hands, but you can't vouch for the person maybe in front of you in a public restroom. So you do want to kind of use that paper towel, turn off the water. I would also say kind of opening the restroom door with that paper towel and then throwing it away. So the active scrubbing part of washing our hands should take a good 10 to 15 seconds. So the whole process from step 1 to kind of turning off the water should take 20 seconds. But that scrubbing needs to be kind of a big part of that 20 seconds. So you should be scrubbing your hands. Good thing to make sure kids are scrubbing their hands for 10 to 15 seconds. So I really like this graphic because it shows you kind of the areas of our hands that we miss when we are washing your hands. So if you, kind of take a look at your hands and kind of think of how you scrub your hands when you're washing your hands, our thumbs are a very frequently missed part of hand washing. Most of us do a really good job of our, 4 fingers, but we don't do kind of the backs of our hands all that well, or we're not kind of doing our thumbs as well as we could be. Also wrists, our wrists are kind of an extension of our hands. So we want to make sure when we're washing our hands, we're going kind of up the wrist as well. You can see in between our fingers, sometimes we miss, and then around our fingernails. So just kind of a good thing to highlight when we are washing our own hands, or when we're kind of teaching kids, or when we're making sure kids are washing their hands properly. And some of you may know about that kind of glow germ that you can kind of look at under a black light. That's a great way to teach good hand washing skills so that kids can actually see with that glow germ kind of what they're missing when they're washing their hands. So we're often asked if it's okay to use hand sanitizer instead of washing our hands. And the short answer is no. Sanitizer does not accomplish the job that only hand washing can do. So sanitizers can reduce the number of germs on your hands in a lot of situations. However, they don't get rid of all types of germs. Hand sanitizers are not as effective if your hands are actually dirty or greasy, just because that hand sanitizer cannot kind of penetrate that dirt and grease. So they don't do that well of a job. They also don't remove chemicals. So, pesticides, for example, or metals, like heavy metals like lead, hand sanitizers don't remove those chemicals. Your best defense when you're thinking of proper hygiene is good old-fashioned soap and water. It's more effective than hand sanitizer at removing certain kinds of germs, especially norovirus. So when we're talking about, the germs that we're seeing right now in the wintertime. We want to make sure we're washing our hands with soap and water to get rid of some of those germs like norovirus, because hand sanitizer just doesn't do as good of a job. So the second thing that we have to kind of focus on when we're focusing on controlling bacteria and making sure our food is safe is preventing cross-contamination. So, we've got, the FDA kind of has their 4 kind of, steps as clean, separate, cook, and chill, right? So this is our separate process, right? So we always want to make sure we're separating our raw food from our ready-to-eat food. We're cleaning, sanitizing all of our equipment. It's a good idea to use different cutting boards, for example, different colored cutting boards to make sure that we're cutting our fresh produce, for example, on a green cutting board, and we're cutting our raw chicken products, meat products on like a yellow cutting board. So another activity for you. So when we're thinking about our home refrigerator, what order would you put this food in? So we're thinking of our fridge and we need to store the following items. How would we store these to prevent cross-contamination? If you want to pop it in the chat, you could. So what would be on top all the way down to the bottom? Okay, uncooked on the bottom. Love it. Putting on the top, everything raw on the bottom. Putting on top is perfect. Raw on the bottom, good. So the reason why we would have pudding on the top is because that is our ready-to-eat food, right? So we want to make sure that our ready-to-eat food is on top of any of our raw products. So perfect. So there's actually an order with our raw product on how we would put it in the fridge. And so this would be kind of how we would do that. So our pudding would be on top because it's our ready-to-eat product. We don't have to fuss with it anymore, right? And then we've got our fish, we've got our beef roast, so, whole cuts. Then we've got our ground, so any kind of ground fish, ground beef, ground turkey. And then we've got our chicken. So the reason for this is based on the final internal cooking temperature. So we cook our chicken to 165 degrees, and that's the highest temperature that we need to cook our raw product. So if, for example, like our beef roast, the packaging that it's in is punctured and it leaks, the beef roast, the chicken is going to be okay because we are kind of cooking off any kind of contamination from beef roast or ground beef because we don't have to cook it as high as we're cooking chicken. So when we're thinking of storage order in our fridge, our chicken should be at the very bottom of our fridge because that is the highest internal cooking temperature. And then we have our ready-to-eat product on top because we don't want any of our raw products to contaminate our fresh product. Good, very nice. So finally, we want to make sure that we're preventing our time and temperature abuse. So again, we talked about our temperature danger zone. Take-home message here is the longer that food is in that 40 degrees to 140 degrees, the more risk there is for foodborne pathogens to grow, right? So think about our summertime graduation parties, right? Sometimes they're a picnic, environment. Sometimes they're at, local parks or something. When that food is in the temperature danger zone, you want to ideally discard it after 2 hours. Now, this is if food is in this picture, it's not being held like on a hot holding dish or, sternos, or it's not in an ice bath. So I'm talking about kind of no temperature control, right? If you're holding food without that temperature control, there's a 2-hour rule. You don't want food to spend more than 2 hours in that temperature danger zone. Okay. And in the summer, so thinking about our graduation parties, if it's really hot outside, you want to follow the 1 hour rule, which is you want to discard that food after 1 hour of being in hot temperatures. Okay. So take home message really is you want to keep our hot foods hotter than 140 because that's the high of our temperature danger zone. And we want to keep our cold foods cold. So that means we're storing our refrigerated foods at 40 degrees or lower. It's a good idea to have a thermometer in our refrigerator, right? So we can kind of verify that it is cold enough. If something is wrong with our temperature, right? And if it's higher than that 40, all of that product in our fridge is actually sitting in the temperature danger zone, right? Or if you're putting a hot, let's say you cooked chili, right? And you didn't cool it enough, you just kind of popped it in the fridge. That's going to raise that internal temperature of the refrigerator higher than that 40 degrees, which kind of puts all of your food at risk. And then we want to, of course, keep our frozen foods at 0 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Just a quick note about freezing. So freezing really keeps food safe indefinitely. I don't like to say forever because, there's a reasonable limit, but it keeps food safe indefinitely. So whenever you're removing something from the freezer, it's going to be food safe. It might not be the quality that you desire, right? So for best quality, when we're talking about quality, we want to use frozen foods between 2 and 4 months of freezing it. Again, quality issue, not a food safety issue. And then when you are thawing that product, there are 4 safe ways to thaw food. First one is think about our Thanksgiving dinner that we're starting to thaw our turkey days before we're going to cook it, right? Best method for thawing food is in the refrigerator. So you know it's 40 degrees or lower, right? It's out of that temperature danger zone. Because it's a turkey, we're going to keep it on our lowest shelf and it's going to be very food safe in there. Other ways are you can submerge that product under running water, right? To thaw it. You can thaw it in a microwave oven, but you only want to do that if you're really going to cook it immediately afterwards. Just because there's a lot of temperature variations in microwaves. It could start to cook in some places, but it could still be like really frozen in other places of the product. So that's a fine way of thawing food, but you want to make sure that you're cooking it immediately afterward. And then it could be as part of the cooking process, right? So I take hamburger patties from my freezer. You can pop them on your griddle, right? Or your grill outside, no problem, as part of the cooking process. Just a few special things to keep in mind when we're prepping food and keeping it safe. We don't want to rinse our raw meat under running water. That increases the risk of cross-contamination because water droplets that are like splashing onto our sink or even kind of onto our counter surfaces. They're not properly cleaned and sanitized. We hear a lot about not eating dough or cookie batter, cookie dough because of the raw eggs. But flour is also a raw food, right? So when we're thinking about flour, the grains from which it's ground is grown in fields, right? And like all food grown outdoors, whether it's our cantaloupe, our onions, our cucumbers, they might be exposed in the ground to harmful bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli. And when those grains are processed, so when those raw grains are from the field, when they're picked from the field and they're processed into flour, that does not kill the harmful bacteria that is present in the field. So a lot of recipes that are made with flour also contain raw eggs, right? And they also contain harmful bacteria. So I think some of us have the misconception that we shouldn't be eating raw cookie dough because of the raw eggs. Not a misconception, that's true. But it's also true that we shouldn't be eating that raw cookie dough because of the raw flour, not just because of the raw eggs. So since 2009, there have been a lot of outbreaks of foodborne illness involving raw flour or raw flour containing products like cake mixes or cookie dough. So it does happen. foodborne outbreaks do happen because of that raw flour. And cooking is the only way to be sure that foods made with flour and raw eggs are safe. So you don't ever want to eat or taste raw flour or raw dough. You want to make sure it's cooked. So if you're making like Play-Doh, for example, what's the first thing the kids are going to do when they open the Play-Doh bucket, right? They're going to put it in their mouths. So you want to make sure if you are kind of making your own homemade Play-Doh that you're using kind of heat treated flour for any raw product. And you can buy heat treated flour in a store. So you always want to make sure, and the FDA has a really neat handout that they kind of use the phrase never devour raw flour, which is quite a tongue twister too. You don't want to eat raw flour. You don't want to eat products, anything that has raw flour in it, because it is a food safety issue. Then when we're cooking food, the only way to know, remember, there's no smell test, there's no sniff test, right? There's no test. The only way to know that a food is done is to make sure that you're using a thermometer to take the temperature of that cooked food, right? So this looks done, right? That chicken looks delicious. Grilled, looks like it's grilled to perfection. Good grill lines on it, right? Looks done. So remember, chicken needs to be cooked at an internal temperature of 165. So actually neither of these pictures is done. We've got 143 on the left, we've got 163 on the right. So that chicken needs to be cooked to 165 to make sure that it is safe from pathogens, safe from bacteria. So all foods have a different cooking temperature, and this is from the USDA, or yeah, the US Food and Drug Administration. So you can Google kind of safe minimum internal cooking temperatures. You would find those anywhere on the internet, but it's good to have a thermometer, use a thermometer, and make sure that you are cooking food to its proper internal temperature. And again, if I can just reiterate, the keeping hot foods hot and cold foods cold. That is the way to keep food safe, to make sure that we're keeping it out of that temperature danger zone. So finally, one more thing I want to touch on before we wrap up and before I open it for any questions is cooling foods. So I talked a little bit about this when we were talking about refrigerating product, right? So cooling is one of the most common reasons for foodborne illness outbreaks. So we need to make sure, like, if we're cooking food, we want to immediately cool it as quickly as possible. We don't want it sitting in the temperature danger zone. So whether that means separating into smaller containers, which makes it cool faster, which means, putting it in an ice bath or something to make sure it cools before putting in the fridge. You don't want to put, so a refrigerator is designed to keep already cold foods cold, right? It is not designed to take your pot of chili that you're putting directly in the fridge and cooling it down quickly. So you want to make sure that that food is cooled before you're putting it in the refrigerator, because if not, it's going to endanger all of the food in there, because it's going to raise that refrigerator temperature. So quickly, I just want to talk about expiration dates. So the USDA estimates that 30% of the food supply is lost or wasted at the retail and consumer levels. And one source of food waste comes from consumers or retailers throwing away perfectly good food because of confusion about the meaning of dates displayed on the label. So as you can see, sometimes we see use by dates or best by dates or best before dates or sell by, discard after. So it's surprising to some that there is only one product in the United States that is federally regulated and needs to have an expiration date. Does anyone know what that is? Let me pause here really quickly. So there's one product in the United States that needs an expiration date, only one. Oh, give us a hint. Okay. I wouldn't eat it, because it's not my age. It's for younger people. It's for little people. Formula. Thank you, Carly. Nice work. A++. So baby formula is the only product that is mandated by the federal government that needs to have an expiration date for safety. All of the rest of these are a quality issue, not necessarily a safety issue. So you see use by, you see best by, you see best before, best if used by, discard after. Those are food quality dates that the manufacturer is putting it on to make sure that you are eating kind of the best quality food. The sell-by date is actually a date that deals with grocery stores and their kind of inventory management. So the sell-by is when stores know to kind of pull their inventory off the shelves. So that's an inventory management date. The rest of them are food quality dates, not necessarily food safety dates. And remember, our spoilage microorganisms, they give us, there is a smell test, there's a sniff test, right? So those spoilage microorganisms that don't necessarily make us sick will give us a hint that the food is no longer good, right? So, just a quick note that expiration dates really are a quality issue, not a food safety issue. Only in the case of baby formula, and not even baby food. Baby food does not need to have an expiration date, just infant formula does. All right, so I'm going to open it up to any questions. This is just a quick resource page for you. We've got articles, we've got online courses, videos, what have you. But I want to at least give us a few minutes to ask and answer any questions that you have.
You can go ahead and drop those in the Q&A box. And I'll also just point out that Beth put together a nice little resource sheet, so you'll all be getting that tomorrow in your email. And that has a lot of, I think they're interesting things that it's good to have as a reference.
For sure. Any questions? Why does baby formula have to have an expiration date, but not baby foods? That's a great question. So baby foods usually are in a jar. So that becomes more of a quality issue as well. But infant formula, because, that formula is specifically designed for infants, they want to make sure it's regulated so that, there's a set expiration date to say this is when you need to discard that product. Ooh, what populations are not susceptible to foodborne illnesses? That's a good question, Heather. So we have our 4 populations that are susceptible. We've got our young ones, we've got our older population, our immunocompromised, our pregnant women. I would say the rest of the population is not susceptible, but that's kind of like a misnomer, because everyone can be susceptible. Everyone can get a foodborne illness, right? In the case of my sister, healthy 30-something, right, was in the hospital for days with salmonella. So, we've got our susceptible populations, but then we've got everyone else who, if the bacterial level is high enough, right? If food has been sitting out for a few hours or something, and remember, that infective dose is enough, anyone can get sick from it. Ooh, it was a stumper. I hope I worded it correctly. Now I'm stressed that I didn't.
I'm sure it's good. The important thing is that we're learning.
Exactly. Ooh, over time, the nutrients in the formula can degrade. Yes, for sure. No, I understand. Did it surprise anyone about the flower safety? Okay, good, good. I usually, that's kind of an eye opener for folks, and it says, like, if you're looking at flour in a store, it says raw product, please cook, so it's a raw product. It is susceptible just like any food, any product that's grown in the grounds. Remember that milling process, that manufacturing process does not remove bacteria or pathogens. So we really need to be careful with our flour. Oh, I'm so glad you learned something new today.
Any other? The post test is in the chat. Also, make sure you go ahead and do that since you all learned things.
Thank you, Heather. Yep. So you bought
Mm.
some cookie dough and it says safe to eat. So it must have been, a heat treated flour that was used.
Mm.
Ooh, can we get immune to some bacteria? Maybe in small doses, but not in that infective dose. I mean, if bacteria are capable of multiplying every 20 minutes, and if it's a high enough infective dose, I would say no. Great questions. Thank you for asking that, Francine. Well, if there are no other questions, I'm going to pass it back to Cassidy in case she has any kind of final things that she needs to tell you about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. I think that was very helpful as far as what we can bring into our classrooms and also just our
Oh, my
daily
pleasure.
lives.
Yes,
Very important things to know.
my pleasure. It was nice to spend an hour with all of you.
We